screen kind of says, I can call it lesson 2. I don't know that that's exactly the right term, considering that lesson 1 went on for a number of weeks, but we're going through each chapter as a lesson of its own. I apologize. What's on screen is what's supposed to be on screen. That's the good news. What is in front of me, on the other hand, is not what is supposed to be in front of me, and it's not the same thing that's on the screen. So to a certain extent, I'm going to be discovering each of these slides along with the rest of you. I've looked them over last night, so the problem is I did not actually bother to look and make sure that the printed out version of it was the same one, and it appears that at some point I made a different printed version than I put on screen and didn't check that, and so here we go. Anyway, so if you want to open up your Bibles to 2 Peter chapter 2, that's where we're going to be pulling a lot of our text, and then as you know from this study already, we'll be looking at some other passages to kind of amplify some of the ideas that are discussed there as well. So, starting in 2 Peter chapter 2, Peter, if you remember in the first chapter, he spent quite a bit of his time, and I say if you remember, that really only applies to some of you, but he spent quite a bit of his time talking in particular about false teachers. And we talked about the idea that Peter is particularly directing this letter at the churches that are struggling with Gnosticism, with a heresy that teaches that Jesus is, well, first of all, it teaches that there is this greater, more secret knowledge about Christ and about the gospel that the average Christian doesn't have access to. And that if they want to get access to it, they have to join up with their movement, accept these people as the teachers, that kind of a thing, and to really accept some ideas that are ultimately very contrary to the gospel. And the two biggest, most contrary ideas are that Jesus either did not come in the flesh, but rather came as a spirit, or that he was not God when he came. Because in the Gnostic view of things, they believe that there are two things. There's spirit and there's the physical, the flesh, which we believe too. The difference is they don't think the two can interact because they think that the spirit is always good and the flesh is always bad. And so within each of us, there is this good spirit surrounded by this evil flesh. And because of the way that they viewed things, that means that Jesus could not simultaneously be God in spirit and in the flesh without breaking the rule about spirit good and flesh bad. And so they have to find one of two ways around that. So they focus on this idea and these teachings. And so Peter spends a lot of that first chapter using, not directly speaking about them, although he does talk a little bit about them in terms of being false prophets, but in particular telling the people that he's writing to that they can be sure that they know everything that they're supposed to know. They're not missing some special information. They are not without some special insight that was given to these people who are teaching this Gnostic movement. He's telling them, you know what you need to know. You got everything you needed to get. And he's basically confirming that what they have is the truth, and this other stuff is just a bunch of lies that's being layered on top of that. So, today he's going to talk a lot more about prophecy, and false prophets in particular. So, he begins in chapter 2, verse 1 by saying, false prophets also arose among the people. This would be the people of Israel that he's been talking about a little bit in the previous chapter. Just as there will also be false teachers among you, who will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the master who bought them, bringing swift destruction upon themselves. Now, we're going to talk more about this in a little bit here, but I want to kind of ask this question. Why do these false teachings come up? Throughout the scriptures, we actually see a number of different reasons why. Anybody have any ideas why these false teachings come about? What are some of the motivations?
Why somebody brings them up?
Okay.
Is that your question?
Well, yeah, so why does somebody, it's one thing to sit around and talk about some stuff and somebody says something that's kind of a crazy idea and we all say, that's probably not it. You know, that's not a false teaching. That's just somebody who is trying to kind of grope their way towards a good idea that just kind of went down the wrong path. That happens to all of us, I think, at some point or another. If we were honest about it, we would admit that at some point or the other we've had some thoughts that we later on went back and said, that was really dumb. I shouldn't have done that. Right? But these are people who've taken up something and now they're running with it and they're teaching.
Probably some kind of a narcissistic attitude, personality that person has. That what I think is right.
Okay.
And everybody else is wrong. And I am correct.
Okay, so one of the things, and if we expand narcissism just a little bit more, one of the things about narcissism that that leads them into that kind of a thinking is, I'm right and everybody else is wrong, and since everybody else is saying this, then my idea must need to be different than theirs. So it almost generates the desire to come up with some new idea. All you have to do is watch sports, not sports on television, but watch people talk about sports, the commentators, and you will see what I'm talking about. Because what you get is, in sports commentators, the people on ESPN, the talking heads, nobody watches them to hear them say what everybody else knows. Sure, this is the best team. These are the best players. This is the team that's most likely going to win. Because everybody's already saying that. And so in order to be interesting on television, you have to have some sort of an unusual take on things. And so you get these guys who will loudly proclaim how smart they are and how right they are and how this is the right thing to think and everybody else is stupid. And of course, when they're wrong, nobody ever goes back, and they certainly never go back and say, oh, my mistake. I didn't know, I was wrong about that. But they're looking for something interesting to say, and more likely than not, it will be wrong, and the few times that it is, they're going to, to announce that as much as they can, as often as they can, point out how smart they are, because they were the one person who thought this. But it's kind of one of those things where, even a blind, stupid, dumb, deaf worm eventually, a bird gets a worm every once in a while. They got one good idea. And so that's where I think a lot of these false teachings come from, is somebody's looking for something interesting, some new take on things, and they run with something, and rather than having, when people say to them, well, that doesn't seem right, what about this, or doesn't that seem to contradict the scripture here, they hold on to that because they think they're right and everybody else is wrong. I'm afraid I don't know your name. I don't remember.
Chad.
Chad.
I was just going to say, I think they're puffed up by knowledge.
Okay.
And in the beginning, he says, don't eat of that tree, the knowledge of good and evil. And so I think we're not to live by knowledge, we're to live by faith. Okay.
Now, there's nothing wrong with knowledge. The problem is that knowledge becomes, it can make you arrogant, and it can make you think you're better than other people.
Self-centered.
Self-centered. And here again, there's an important distinction. There is something to be said for knowledge. We don't want to go around being ignorant. You can't have a sound faith if you don't know the Word well enough to understand what it says. And knowing more and more about the Word and gaining wisdom and gaining knowledge is a good thing if it leads us to a better understanding of the Word through faith. But if we set out on a quest for knowledge and we leave faith behind, it doesn't take very long at all before we start looking for ways to look smarter than everybody else. And so I think that idea of knowledge that's uninformed by faith is a dangerous kind of a thing, and it can lead you into some very false places. Mark?
I was going to say, too, we have the written word in front of us. We have it. We have all the books. We have the letters that was sent to these different churches. They didn't have that either. So it was easier for these false prophets to come in and says, really what it is this, And so they could get themselves in, and it would be a lot harder unless Paul or someone is there to say, no, you're wrong.
Yeah.
And it led a lot of people the wrong way.
Yeah. When you have someone come in who says, that this is what really happened, and you don't have anything to compare that against, or this is what it really means, and you don't have anything to compare it against. Think about today how much we struggle in churches and religious groups in general when somebody says, this is what I feel about something. I feel this way. Well, that doesn't seem to be what the scriptures say. Yeah, but it's what God has put on my heart. Well, my brother used to say, when you're having an argument with somebody, whatever point they say, in the argument, one of the two sides says, God told me this, the argument is over, because how do you trump that? No, God told me you were wrong. I mean, how do you answer that? So it doesn't mean the person won the argument. It simply means that there's no point in continuing to have a discussion with someone who's telling you that they believe that God has told them something, whether they use those words or not, because that is going to, in their minds, trump anything else. And so in a situation where someone either thinks it's true or doesn't think it's true, either way, as long as they're earnest about it, it would be very difficult in the absence of scriptures to overcome that. Now, with that said, there was actually a miraculous gift in the first century called the gift of knowledge. And although we don't have, there's not a detailed records of if you want to know about any of the superpowers of any of the Marvel Comics characters, there's actually a book about that tells you what they do and how they look at everything. We don't have one of those for the early gifts of the Spirit in the church. But the gift of knowledge seems to have related to the idea that these were people who were given a divine understanding of what was true and what wasn't true. And so if your church had somebody like that, then hopefully they would be able to say, okay, this isn't true. and hopefully you would listen to them, but ultimately it still becomes a competition of who sounds more right, you know? And so this is a major tool of false teachers. Now, what's fascinating is how prevalent false teachers still are today, even though we do have the word, you know? So they had to kind of adapt their tactics a little bit there, but that is a major tactic or a major tool. What else? Why else might a false teacher want to or choose to teach something that they know is false?
Arrogance.
Okay, we've got arrogance. We've kind of talked about narcissism and stuff like that. What else? What other benefits do they sometimes get? Okay, money.
Verse 3, greed.
Okay, greed, exactly. You're looking up there. You actually read ahead of us, but it's right there on the screen, so it's not too hard. It's greed. And a lot of what Peter is talking about has to do with greed. And that can be greed for money, which in this case it seems like most likely it was. It can also be greed for power. Because when people listen to what you say and do what you tell them to, that is a powerful narcotic for a lot of people. You know, a lot of people who find themselves in positions of power have a hard time making good choices once they're in there, because the temptation to use that power for their own sake and to accumulate more power so they can have more of that feeling is a very strong urge. I can tell you that some of the times when I've preached to a large congregation of people, the largest group I can think that I preached to in this kind of a context was probably 500 or 600 people. And the sermon that I gave was one that particularly grabbed people's attention. So there's a point in that sermon where it's really in the introduction, and I lead up to this, and suddenly, and when I stopped, the entire congregation was dead silent, which can be a bad thing in some circumstances, but given the context, it was actually a good thing. It's what the effect I wanted. But there was this moment there where I realized that all of these people were listening to everything that I said, and would take almost anything that I said as something they should at least seriously consider. And that's sort of a narcotic to a certain extent. You're kind of like, wow, this is kind of cool, you know. And then there's another part of you, hopefully at least, there was in my case, that said, okay, wait a minute, it's nice that you've done this, but this is not something you need to go seeking after. This is not going to be a good thing. But for a lot of people, that's not the way it works. And so whether it's money or whether it's power, there's greed that comes into this for a lot of people. They want more of something, and using false teachings is a way to get it. Because if you're teaching the true gospel of Christ, what profit is that to you? Is that the place to make money teaching the true gospel of Jesus Christ? To become wealthy, I guess I should say. I obviously make some money off of preaching the gospel of Christ, so I don't want to make this too, hypocritical here. But did Jesus ever teach to anyone that becoming one of his disciples was a good way to fabulous wealth and riches? No. If you think that's true, you have not been paying attention to the scriptures at all. Jesus taught a lot about how dangerous wealth was and talks about giving things up and getting things back in return, but most of the things you're getting back in return are spiritual things. They are long-term future benefits. So Jesus doesn't talk about that. And yet if you want that, and by the same token, think about power. If you look at the most influential people in the Bible, in the New Testament, who are the top 2 or 3? Who's the number 1, obvious? Top 1. Jesus himself. Who comes in not too distant second behind him? Paul, actually. Like in New Testament. Moses is, if we talk about the Old Testament. Paul comes in second when we think about long term, because Paul's writings have influenced and affected the way that the church organized and operates ever since his lifetime. Peter is probably in kind of the 3rd place, and then you start thinking about people like John the Baptist in terms of laying the foundation for Jesus, and some of these other writers. And when you look at them and you look at their histories, none of them became wealthy. None of them became powerful in their own time. People listened to them, but they didn't order them around. When you look at the apostles and how they led the church in the 1st century, it's really interesting because when we see them doing things in general, making decisions that affect the church as a whole, and I mean like the whole church everywhere, we see them doing it in consultation with the elders of the church in Jerusalem, with the members of the church in Jerusalem. They aren't taking their power and lording it over everybody else and saying, we're going to tell you what to do. They're discussing it, and they're getting informed ideas, and they're making good decisions, not based on what's best for them, but what's best for the church as a whole. And so the reality is that if you're following Jesus' teachings, you are not going to accumulate power in this life. You are not going to accumulate wealth in this life. You may have success, but that success is going to be measured in God's terms, not in your terms.
So, and maybe there's another point that's not associated with greed or money, but just a minister or elders or something that want to grow a congregation. And so they're willing to sacrifice some of the older standards and say, those are older standards, now we need to think about a more progressive stance.
Okay.
And so in that case, they fully believing in what they're doing are not maintaining the truth, they're teaching falsely, or they're not teaching properly.
Okay. And that's compromise for the purpose of efficacy, to make things easier in some way. You know, and we absolutely see that. And again, in that case, it usually comes out of a place of good intentions. And more often than not, what we see there is pulling back from asserting all of what's true, rather than necessarily outright teaching things that are false, but laying aside some of what's true in order to make it easier, to make it more palatable for people to come in from the world and feel comfortable within the church itself. And so not all of these come from a place where you're trying to do bad things. The ones that Peter's talking about do, but there's a lot of other reasons. Jerry?
The reverse of what Steve just said is also true. I think Ecclesiastes tells us this, don't be too religious. I'm not sure what that actually means, and I've never heard anybody that could really explain it, but he does say that. And I think it may be a matter of the reverse of what Steve is talking about, that you're getting into so much detail in the scripture that it becomes your idea instead of God's idea.
And that's the curse of the Pharisees.
Yes.
The Pharisees are not trying, well, by Jesus' time it's debatable, but what got the Pharisees on the wrong path wasn't a desire to teach the wrong thing. It wasn't a desire to lead people astray. It wasn't a desire to profit from what they were teaching. It was ultimately a reaction to what they saw in their community as the leaders of that community increasingly embraced things like Greek culture and Greek principles, and that they saw a group of people that were trying to unify the kingship of Israel with the priesthood of Israel, which had been kept very clearly separate in the scriptures, and they were basically turning it into a secular kind of a kingdom. And the Pharisees knew that this kind of turning away from God had once before led them to be taken into captivity, and they didn't want to see that happen again. And so what the Pharisees began to do was to try to build a fence around what was true to make sure that nobody got away from that and into stuff that was false. And if you think about our pool fences, actually, I guess most of us who live up here don't have pools, but how many of you live down in the valley where you had a pool at some point in life? Wow, Jerry, that's just, he's the only, okay, so if you have a pool fence, my family, we had a pool, the house I grew up in, and we had a fence around it because that's what you do if you're a responsible pool owner. Now, do you think that the fence was just like right at the edge of the pool? No, why wouldn't you put, just as a practical matter, why wouldn't you put the fence right at the edge of the pool, surrounding the pool?
Climb the fence and fall in the pool.
Okay, so there's that possibility, but I mean, you can always climb the fence and walk and fall in the pool, but there's a more fundamental reason. What's going to happen when you're in the pool?
Get out of it.
Exactly, okay? The problem with having a fence all the way around the pool, right next to the pool, is it makes the pool a lot less fun because you can't get in and out of it, you know? And so you build your fence a ways back from the pool just for practical purposes. And the Pharisees, they were concerned because as the world changed around them, they saw some of the places where the old law didn't really deal with some things. In particular, one of the biggest changes was the move from a society that was almost everybody owned their own farm and raised their own animals and their own crops, to a society in which a smaller number of people owned a lot of land and people worked for them and made money off of that. And if you look in the Old Testament, there's no provision whatsoever meaningfully made for contributing to the Lord or offering to the Lord money. You're supposed to offer animals and grain and wheat and things like that, and you're supposed to tithe out of those things. So for a lot of reasons, the Pharisees are looking and saying, okay, we got to make sense of how we apply the scriptures in this world. And what we don't want people to do is to get too close to the bad things. So we're going to build fences a little ways back from those things. And so somebody comes and asks a question, I don't have any animals, how do I offer a sacrifice? And the answer is, well, we'll set up basically a giant human vending machine at the outskirts of the temple so you can buy your stuff and take it and then sacrifice it. Seems like a great solution until it becomes a way for people to just make money, And so they come up with all these different answers, and somebody comes and asks them a question, and rather than saying, I don't know the answer to that, or there's nothing in the scriptures that say one way or the other, they always had to have an answer. And when you always have to have the answer, when you always have to be right, you end up being wrong a lot more of the time than you otherwise would be if you just said, hey, there's not an answer to this.
Well, I think they wanted a worldly answer, and it wasn't that. It was a...
Well, it became that. It didn't start that way. By Jesus' time, it has morphed into that. It has morphed into them looking for ways to control, into looking for ways to enrich themselves, into looking for ways to do things that will benefit them in a worldly sense. They didn't start that way. That's the sad thing. If we go and look at the history, they started off trying to keep people from doing things they shouldn't do. But to do that, they had to start making up rules that didn't exist. And once you start making up rules that don't exist, that power thing kicks in again. And pretty soon you start making up rules that not only don't exist, but they're not to try to keep people away from doing bad things, they're more for what's good for you. And so that profit motive starts to come in, that greed motive starts to come in. So even when we're doing it for good reasons, making up rules, whether we think it's to protect people or whatever it is, when we start making up rules, when we start reading into rules, when we start saying, hey, we've always done it this way, so that's the rule, that's a problem. And it becomes a form of false teaching and binding people on things on people that shouldn't be bound on them. So we have to be careful, even when we have good motives. But the people that Peter is dealing with, for the most part, he says they don't have good motives. Because it's pretty hard to get to where these guys are without having some pretty messed up motives. Because what they're teaching, the gospel story that's been told to most of these people is about God coming to earth as a man, going through that life and then suffering and dying as a human being would suffer and die, and then being resurrected. When you start pulling the main components out of that story and saying that's not really the truth, I've got a better thing, I've got more than you need to know, it's pretty hard to do that in good conscience. At least if you're the ones that are really out there promulgating. But the people who end up getting kind of caught up into this are a little bit more innocent in this, although ultimately they're paying attention to the wrong story, but still, they're maybe not quite as self-focused and greed-motivated as these other ones are. But we have to be careful about the people that are talking to us and what they're saying to us, and that includes me, because for good reasons and for bad reasons, for right motives and for wrong motives, people who are talking, people who are teaching, have the ability to get it wrong.
2 Timothy, try the spirits.
That's right. And so the easiest way to figure out whether the guy who's standing in front talking, or the one who's leading your discussion talking, or the guy who's telling you, the woman who's telling you something that sounds really good but a little weird too, is to go compare it to what? Scripture. Scripture. You don't go compare it, sometimes you can go compare it to things other people have said. There's lots of good commentaries and lots of good sermons out there, so there's some of that. But first and foremost, we go and compare it to the Scriptures. And we say, this isn't right, or this is right. Or, he said it didn't really say it, and sure enough, it doesn't really say. What does that mean? So we have to ask those questions. We have to be open-minded about that, but we have to ask the question. We don't just accept what somebody says as true just because it sounds good or because they are a convincing speaker.
The easiest lie is the one that has the most truth.
That's true as well. That could be a lie. No, I'm sorry. That can blow your mind real quick. But no, that's absolutely true. The easiest way to lead people astray is to tell them little lies or parts of the truth with a little bit of a lie mixed into it. If somebody comes in here and says, everybody look, the sky has turned blue. No, not blue, it's already blue. Has turned green. It's real easy to go out and check, But if they build in, a story about what's in the air, there's some kind of toxic chemical in the air that's being released by all these corporations. Actually, that's true on one level, but it's, you come up with some weird, idea about these things. We know that there's pollution, and we know that sometimes people get sick for no apparent reason. We start thinking, hey, maybe this is true, And so, in those kind of situations, you put some truth and some falsehood together, and people have a hard time breaking them back out apart again.
Did God really say?
Yes, well, and did God really say? And technically, he didn't say that.
Sorry.
That was one of those things where, if you notice what he said is, what he asked is, did God really say that if you eat any of the trees, that you'll die? Well, no, he didn't say that. He said, if you eat from this particular tree, you'll die. But you also notice that when Eve responds, her response to him is, we have been told not to eat from it or even touch it, or we'll die. And he didn't say that either. He only said eat from it. He didn't say anything about touching it. Now, so what is she doing when she says to not touch it? What's she doing?
Adding a layer.
She's building a fence. She's building a fence around the tree, metaphorically in this situation. And so she has already misunderstood or misapplied God's command, and that makes it that much easier for the serpent to pull her even further away from him. So the weakness of humanity is the tendency to try to impose our own understanding of the rules on top of the rules, because of our pride, because of our inherent arrogance. And the result is that it makes us that much easier and much more vulnerable to false teachings. Steve?
I was just going to make a comment that my uncle, who's gone now, smart guy, thought that the condensation trails from jets were secretly dispensing things on us to get us to comply with the government and stuff.
All right.
And it's the contrails. You look up and go, there, it's happening, it's coming. And I was like, Uncle Bob, really?
It didn't work on him, apparently.
I
So,
go, how do all these jets get that stuff in? Well, it's done secretly. The government secretly does it at the airports, and no one knows. So I said, okay.
Yeah, that's one of those conversations that it's really not worth.
Well,
it's a good idea to
so it just goes to show you, though, that people can believe a lot of
Yeah.
crazy things.
And it's, if there's any, no, that's not true. There's a lot of dangerous things about the internet. There's a lot of good things about it, there's a lot of dangerous things. One of the more dangerous things about the internet is the degree to which it spreads false knowledge so rapidly. And it makes it so easy for people. On the one hand, it's great because it spreads actual knowledge very, very rapidly. It makes communication and being aware of what's going on in the world around us so much easier, and having access to knowledge so much faster. But it also makes it that much easier for people to spread false knowledge and false information and mislead people. And because of that, we live in an age in which, on the one hand, we know more about what's happening around the world than anyone in history ever has. And on the other hand, we have less certainty about what's actually true about what's going on next door to us than anyone ever has. And so it's a very, very weird situation that we're in, and it definitely aids false teachers in spreading lies and false teachings as well. So, okay, so there's a lot of reasons why false teachers introduce heresies. And generally speaking, if they're doing it for motives that are impure. So some people are doing it maybe because they're trying to do the right thing and they get it wrong. But the ones who are doing it for impure reasons, the ones Peter's talking about here, he says that they secretly introduce them. Nobody comes in and says, hey guys, I've got this really terrible idea that I want you all to join me in, Nobody says that. I mean, like the Legion of Doom and the Super Friends comics did on TV. They were like just looking up for evil things to do. But normal people don't do that. You don't get people on board by saying, let's do the worst thing we can think of. So they do it secretly, and they usually build it up. They don't start right off saying, okay, here's my whole idea with all of the obvious flaws in it. What they do is they start by telling you a little bit of something. And then they want to add a little bit more, and they want to add a little bit more, until it becomes overwhelming, or until you have been gradually led astray.
If you shoot a rocket to the moon and you're off 1 degree, you won't hit the moon.
That's true.
And that's what you're saying. you're teaching error 1 degree at a time.
And I think that, that's true. You're trying to get people further and further away. Most people don't start off with some little thing and then it stops there. They get more and more away from things. And maybe even the first few things aren't necessarily wrong. Maybe they're just in a gray area or something like that. But it gets further and further away. And so we just have to be really careful about how we approach truth and how we approach what people are teaching us. And then Peter says something else, and this is really an important point here. He says, many will follow their sensuality, and because of them, the way of truth will be maligned. And in their greed, they will exploit you with false words. So right there, he starts to bring out motives. We've already talked about the motives of the teachers, but it also starts to bring out some of the reason why people like what they're saying. He says sensuality. What is sensuality?
Sounds good.
Okay. It sounds good.
It says shameful ways.
What's that? So, what does yours say?
Shameful ways.
Okay, there's shameful ways. So what are we talking about when we talk about sensuality or shameful ways? When we put those two words in the same context together, what kind of behavior are we talking about?
Their internal desires.
Okay, they're chasing after the human fleshly desires that they have. Now that could be sexual desires, certainly, but that can also be a lot of other kinds of desires that we have. Desires for power, desires for money, desires to, feel good about ourselves, whatever it is. They're chasing after their own self-will rather than chasing after the heart of God, the way David is described as doing. And so the people that follow them, more often than not, when they get into the stuff, at least that's really obviously wrong, continue to follow them, not necessarily because they believe it's right in the most straightforward sense, but because it feels good, because it lets them do what they want to do. And so in the case of the Gnostics, there were two major sides of them, or two groups of them. One of them were called the, let's forget these terms. One of them were called the, all right, so one of them basically believed that they could that because the body and the flesh were different, they could do whatever they wanted to with their bodies. So we want to, engage in sexual immorality. That's okay because it's not a spiritual thing; it's just my body doing stuff. If I want to, use drugs and get myself high, that's okay. It's just my body getting high. It's not my spirit. The other side believed that because the body was evil, they needed to do things to make sure that the body suffered, so that evil would be suffered and purged from them. And so they would engage in self-flagellation. And they would deny themselves food to the point of being basically starving. They would basically deny their physical in all possible ways and make it suffer as much as they could in order to purge those desires from them. Now, which of the two groups do you think tended to attract more adherents? If you had to guess. You're all giggling because you know the answer, right? It's the side that's doing things that they want to do, okay? Now, there were definitely ones on the other side. But more likely was the ones who wanted to make themselves feel good and do things that made them happy. And so when Peter here is talking about the ones following their sensuality, he is primarily talking about the ones who are chasing after things that make them feel good. But even the other side, even trying to make your body suffer, is still a function of sensuality, because it's you imposing your will and trying to overcome, to try to, not to discipline yourself, but to make your body suffer. It's still being rooted in thinking about the physical world as being the source of the problems, the heart of the issue, where Peter and Paul and Jesus all talk about the idea that it's not what your body is wanting that's the problem, it's what your spirit is wanting. Paul says, I struggle against my will to do bad things. Not, I struggle against my body, I struggle against my own self. Jesus says it's not what's on the outside that makes a man evil, it's what comes out from inside of him. So there's either way you look at it, there's still this excessive focus on the physical rather than focusing on the spiritual. So we have sensuality, we have the way of truth being maligned, because in general it's not good enough for people who are teaching bad things or wrong things to simply say, here's my idea, it's the best idea. They have to say, here's my idea, and here's why this guy's a bad guy, and why his ideas are all wrong. Because in general, if you test two ideas against one another and you hold them up against the truth becomes pretty apparent as to which one of them is right. But if you've made it so that you don't trust the other guy and you think that, that he's a bad person, and especially when we talk about the context of these people who have this gift of knowledge, boy, if you're a false teacher, those are the first people you got to find some way to shut down, right? You got to find some way to marginalize them. You've got to find some way to make them less significant. And when you look at, historically, people who have taken control of organizations and even societies, one of the first things that they start doing is looking for people who can challenge them with logic, challenge them with good arguments, challenge them with facts. They start trying to find ways to minimize them, to get them separated from everybody else, whatever it is, because they don't want somebody who has good ideas, the right ideas, to be there to stand up and say, okay, let's look at his idea and let's look at my idea. So they want to make it about them, and they want to make it about the other person, and they want the other person look bad. And then Peter ends with these words: their judgment from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. And he's going to talk more about this in the coming days. But the key point for us to understand, and this goes back to a parable that Jesus taught. Jesus talks about the church, and he describes it at one point. He describes it a number of different times as a field. But in one particular parable he preaches, he talks about a situation where the owner of the field went out and he had his people, and they sowed good seed throughout the field. And an enemy comes in. I always thought, what kind of a weird enemy would this be? Who comes along and apparently has nothing better to do with his time than to go through and sow weeds throughout the field as well. But that's what happens, and so when the wheat begins to grow up, the weeds begin to grow up as well alongside the wheat. And the man's servants say to him, do we go pull up the weeds? And he says no, because if you pull up the weeds, what's going to happen? You're going to pull up the wheat along with it, and it's not going to become any good. So what does he say? What's the solution? You wait for harvest. And then in harvest, you separate them out. Now that adds more work, no question about it. But at least that way you get to keep all the wheat, and you don't lose a bunch of the wheat trying to get rid of the weeds. So one of the things that we struggle with a lot of times is that we see people doing things that we know are wrong. In the church, out of the church, whatever. And it doesn't always seem like the consequences fit the behaviors that they're engaging. And one of the things that Peter is going to spend quite a bit of time talking about later on in this book is that there is, in fact, a consequence coming. There is, in fact, judgment that's going to come. And that the fact that God is waiting, the fact that it's taking a long time from our perspective, should not cause us to lose hope, shouldn't cause us to believe that we can get away with whatever we want to, because ultimately this life is not the final say in what's going to happen to us. And the consequences for a lot of evil behavior doesn't come about until after this life. And that's when it will be seen. And so he says their judgment is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. It's waiting. It hasn't maybe come to fruition yet, but it is going to come. Okay. Any more comments or thoughts about this before I go to the next slide? Jared?
Just throw something else out there. What scares me and worries me about this idea is the scriptures that are not as clear as we would like them to be. The interpretation that you put and my interpretation may not agree. And there is, do I push my interpretation or do you push your interpretation? It's just a concern that I have.
And there's no easy answer to that problem, because the thing is, we look at Paul writing to the Romans and later to the Corinthians and saying, you know what, it's okay to eat meat. You don't have to worry about that. But if somebody doesn't feel like they should eat meat, then you shouldn't do it in front of them because you're going to lead them astray. And it's a great analysis. And if we had that problem in the church today, we would know exactly what to do because we have this fantastic analysis for it. And it does create principles for us, but it's a difficult principle to figure out how to apply to a specific situation. Should we do this because we think it's okay to do this, even though somebody else doesn't think it's okay, or should we not do it because one person doesn't think it's okay to do this? And it becomes particularly problematic in the context of our congregational worship and congregational activities, how to apply that principle. And it's not always an easy kind of a thing to do. And so we struggle with this, and we have struggled with this for a long time in churches, and really for all of time in churches, but even more so today, And unfortunately, the Gospels and the letters were written, and they teach principles, but they teach application only in the specific instances that arise. And so we no longer have problems, for the most part, that arise relating to those specific issues, but we struggle applying those principles in other places. And it's hard for, to know the answer to that. It used to be that there were enough churches in most larger communities that you could find a church that viewed things, and I'm talking about churches of Christ in this particular context, but you could find a church that viewed pretty much all the important things the same way you did. And if there was another church that viewed enough things differently, then you didn't have to go to that one, you could go to a different one. And you might say, well, that sounds like you're, like you're sort of forum shopping or something like that. And to an extent you are, but there's no inherent reason why there's something wrong with going and looking for people who tend to see things the same way you do, because you'll be more comfortable there and you'll feel like your faith is being affirmed better there. The problem is that as churches have been dying off, it's increasingly difficult to do that. And you increasingly find either extreme polar sides of the equation in places, or you find only one monolithic view. And if you don't happen to agree with that view, you can find it very difficult to fit in there and to feel comfortable there. Now, you raised your hand a long time ago, and I don't know if you had a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, 1 Timothy 6:12 says, fight the good fight of faith. So it says it's a fight.
Yes.
But I think it's our faith we have to hold on to.
Yes.
Where, like Jerry, you say you're not sure if it's, I guess you're not real sure about it. So that's where our faith comes in, I think. And I don't think we're to understand it all. Because I think our brain is, God is so, how do you even fathom what he's done? It's just, we can't.
And it isn't as though all of this was written necessarily to have it all applies to us. But in some cases, it may not directly apply to us in the immediate sense. Corinthians, for example, 1 Corinthians was written to an extraordinarily dysfunctional church. And so a lot of what's being said in Corinthians, while it's absolutely true, and while it contains principles that are absolutely true, if we try to apply it too literally, it can be very problematic in a church that's healthy, because you don't need it's kind of like, you don't need chemotherapy if you don't have cancer. It would cause you some serious problems even if you do have cancer, but if you don't have cancer, it will cause you some serious problems. So you don't necessarily have to apply the principles the same way in one church as you do in another church, even though the principles exist. And so I think there's a lot of flexibility in the scripture that we have been reluctant to embrace, but I also think we have to be very careful about how we go about doing it. Steve?
Yeah, I think the direct commands and the examples, we pretty much agree on those. It's when we get into the matters of opinion that we have our struggles.
Right.
In my opinion, we can do anything we want in worship, and someone else says, no, I'm really offended by that. And so, but that's your opinion. You shouldn't, so anyway,
Right.
It's like that one guy that they rescued off of the desert island, and somebody discovered him and got him on board, and he said, well, is anybody else on the island? He goes, no, I'm the only one. And they noticed there was 3 huts on the beach, and he's, well, what are those there? And, well, the one on the right there, that's my house. That's where I lived. And then, what's that one? Well, that's the church I go to. And what's the third one? Well, that's the church I used to go to. And so, he couldn't even get along with himself. So there's a lot of truisms in that, though.
And part of the issue becomes, what if it's, from one person's perspective, it's not their opinion, it's their firmly held belief that this is wrong, and somebody else is saying, well, that's really just your opinion. That becomes an issue as well. And the core, when you get right down to it, the core disagreement that led to it, when the churches of Christ and the disciples of Christ, and the names are kind of fluid, but when what would later become the Christian churches, when they had merged together and they were working together for a number of years in the 1800s, the core split between them wasn't over specifically instruments and music in worship. It wasn't over specifically, how to take the communion. It wasn't over those things. What it was over was a broader concept. And the issue is this: the churches of Christ believed that anything that the scriptures didn't say you could do, you couldn't do. And the disciples of Christ believed that anything the scriptures didn't say you couldn't do, you could do. And that seems like a very small distinction, but it's a very huge distinction when you get right down to it, because it's the difference between if it doesn't say anything, that I'm free to do it, I'm free to approach it how I want to, versus if it doesn't say anything, I'm not allowed to do anything except what it does say. And the churches of Christ have modified their view of that in many ways in the present. And the disciples of Christ, the Christian movements, have modified their view of that as well in many ways as well. And so ironically, we've come closer back together in many respects today than we were when they split apart and got the widest apart in the mid-1900s. But still, that fundamental difference of opinion or a viewpoint about what the scriptures say drives a lot of how we understand the scriptures. So there's not always an easy answer to this, and I think it probably begins, in terms of wisdom at least, with understanding that there's not always an easy answer to this, and recognizing that we are all trying to use faith and study and wisdom to apply the principles of the scripture. And if we're all trying to do that legitimately, I don't have nearly as much of a fear of large-scale false teaching breaking out. It's when one of the elements of that break down. Either we're not studying, we're not having faith, we are not applying wisdom. You take one of those things out, and that's when things start to get off track real fast. All right, we've got to take a break here because we're a little over time, so we'll come back in at 10:30 and start off with our worship today. Thank you.